And before we get started, let's just put your names in the chats just so I know who is present in the session. That will help me record the session's attendance as well. Right. So while everybody puts their name in the chat, let's just talk about the topics on. So today we'll be covering the DOM, that is document object model, uh, different event listeners, and HTML forms. And the main goal of the session is to get just a little bit of idea on how we can make web pages interactive. So this is going to be our agenda for today. There'll be just we'll just be looking at three main areas. That is the document object model or DOM, and then we'll talk about events and listeners, which is really about how web pages respond, and then finally we'll take a look at HTML forms, which are one of the main ways that we could collect user input on a page. So the overall goal for today is just to build an understanding on how we can make these web pages interactive. And let's start with the DOM. So what is exactly a DOM? Well, as I mentioned before, it stands for Document Object Model. It's basically the browser's live hierarchical representation of your web page. So instead of JavaScript directly changing the HTML file, it changes this live version of the page in the browser. A helpful way to think about this is as a tree structure. The HTML element will always remain at the top, and then you have its children called head and body, and inside those you have other elements like headings, paragraphs, divs, and spans. So this structure is what makes web pages interactive. JavaScript can use this object model to find elements, change them, add new ones, or remove them in real time without ever having the need to reload the page. And so let's take a quick now that we know what uh, now that we have an idea of what a DOM is, the next question is how do we actually find elements on the page so that we can work with them? So that is where selectors can come in. In JavaScript, we use CSS style selectors to target elements. The two main methods here that are typically used are query selector and query selector all. So the query selector finds the first element that matches the selector. So if I write document.querySelector with the hashtag title in the quotes, JavaScript will look for the first element with the ID title, whereas querySelectorAll finds all the matching elements and gives them back as a list, which is useful for when you want to work with multiple elements at once. So in this example on the right, if I use the query selector all and in the quotes, if I put dot highlight, I will get all elements with the class highlight. So, so just in simple terms, if you want one element, you should use query selector. And if you want all matching elements, that is where you should use query selector all. And now let's try to understand more about what would be like to create and manipulate elements with JavaScript. Try to think of it as a try to think of it now I have mentioned that with the DOM you can add or or remove elements to so in order to do that we could try to think of it as building something in memory first and then placing it on the page. So try to I'm sure there have been times where you have assembled furniture from IKEA it before putting it in place. So which is one way to consider one way to picture what the create element would be doing here. So and then the so whenever we want to create a new element, we would want to use the create element method, and then once that element is created, uh, once that it gives us the element in memory, but it still does not appear on the page yet. And so the moment and the only way we can make the content the element appear on page is if we add some content to it. And the safest way to do it is to use text content and not inner HTML, because inner HTML can introduce security risks if content ever came from user input. And then after that, we would want to find the parent element to place it inside. So with something like document.querySelector, we use, and then once we find the appropriate parent element is when we would use the append child method to insert the new element into the DOM so that it becomes visible on the page. So if I had to go through this in a nutshell, so create element makes the element, text content gives it content, and query selector helps us find where it should go, and then append child is what finally puts it on the page. And so, one thing that you should always remember is that create element by itself never puts anything on the page. You always have to explicitly append it somewhere. Now let's move into events and events listeners, which is how we make pages respond to user actions. And event, let's try to understand by what an event is. So an event is any action that occurs in the browser, like it could be a click, it could be a key press, or it could be submitting a form or overall. An event listener is a JavaScript function that waits for that specific event to happen on a particular element. And when that event occurs, JavaScript gives us something called the event object. That object contains useful details about what happened, including things like the element that triggered the event. So in this example here, we first use query selector to target the button, and then we attach an event listener with the add listener event listener method, which in this sense we're just adding a event listener for a non-click event. So when a button is clicked, the function runs, logs a message, and also logs the event.target, which tells us which element has triggered the click. So the idea here is events are the actions, listeners wait for them, and then the event object gives us information about what exactly happened. Now, if we were to add, another pattern that we should be aware about is attaching listeners to multiple events efficiently. This would come up a lot when you have several buttons or cards that should all respond to clicks. So instead of adding selectors one by one, which could get a bit tedious, we could definitely use the query selector all method to grab them all at once. And then the for each is essentially a for loop to which will loop through that collection and attach a listener to each element. So that is one of the clean patterns that we can see in this slides. So, so this is how you would go about attaching event listeners. And this approach remains clean regardless of whether you have like one elements or one like five elements or even 20 elements. Now, let's try to move into HTML forms, which are one of the main ways we collect user input on a web page. So so each form is represented by a form tag, which is the main container that wraps all the user inputs together. There are a few key attributes to know here. The first here is action, which tells us where the form should be sent. Form data should be sent. The second is the method, which tells us how the data should be sent. And now there are multiple methods to send form data to a server, but let's take a look at two of the most commonly used methods here. One of them is get. So with get, the data is appended to the URL, which is commonly so this is commonly used for things like search forms. And then with post, the data is sent in the request body, which is more common when we are trying to create, submit, or update any data. And then there is name, which is a very important attribute because it acts like the key for the data coming from each input. So if an input does not have a name, that value typically will not be included properly when the form is submitted. So the main takeaway from this slide would be that the form groups the input. Action says where the data goes. Method says how it goes, and the name attribute helps identify each piece of submitted data. Now, let's try. Let's try to focus on certain input types. And in other words, the type attribute is the primary way to define the nature of an input element. And this matters because changing the type can completely change both the appearance and the behavior of the input and the page. And there is also then choosing the correct type also ensures better user experience and data validation. Let's take a look at some common input types. The uh, first one is text, which is used for generic single line input like a name. And then there's the password, which hides the characters for privacy. And number is used whenever we would like numeric input. And then date can provide a native date picker, which is supported by many browsers. So choosing the correct input type helps improve both user experience and the validation because the browser can help guide the user towards entering the right kind of data. And if you ever wish to record text input which could go on for multiple lines, we could always use the text area tag instead of input. Now, let's try to take a look at selection elements. And the main idea is that these selection elements offer different kinds of choices. They provide there are several ways to capture user selections now and drop down, and they're often known as drop downs or select elements. They are ideal when you have a long list of options and you want to save space on the page. Radio buttons are used when the user must choose exactly one option from a small set of predefined choices. Now, checkboxes are more flexible because they allow the user to choose either no options or one option or multiple option. So it depends on what kind of input type you would want to use. if you want, if there are many options and you would like one choice, you could use either a drop down or radio buttons, where if the number of choices are limited, and then if you would like an option to have multiple answers, that is where checkboxes should be used. And then one thing to note about radio buttons is that they all should must share the same name attribute to be grouped together. So that is why in the example that we see, selecting one t-shirt's size would automatically deselect the other. And the main reason behind that is because the name attribute is the same for all choices that you can see on the screen. And now let's try to take a look at different other elements. Now, of course, every form must have a button and field set. So it is essential to create you because every form usually includes buttons and some structure to keep things organized. So let's try to take a look at buttons. Whenever you use a button element, you should always declare the type explicitly. Now, some of those types involve submit, is used when the button should send the form data, while the type button is for custom actions which can be later on controlled by JavaScript. And then the other key and then some other inputs are key elements here are field set and legend. A field set is used to group related inputs together visually and semantically, and the legend element provides the caption for that group, which helps us improve clarity and accessibility. So in this example that we can see right here, the contact information inputs are grouped inside a field set, and the text contact information comes across from the legend. So the takeaway from this slide is always you should always be explicit when it comes to button types, and use field set and legend to organize related form inputs in a way that is clearer and more accessible to users. So, so to wrap up this presentations, I the main ideas I want you to leave with are these. So first of all, the DOM is basically your HTML represented as a live edible tree in the browser. So that's what allows JavaScript to find elements, update them, or create new ones, or remove them dynamically. Second, events and listeners are what makes pages you respond to user actions, whether it's a click, typing into a field, hovering over something, or submitting a form overall. Event listeners are how we tell JavaScript to react. And then lastly, forms are one of the main ways that we collect and send user data on a web page. So understanding things like input types, names, buttons, and group formed elements is really important. And so I think that is the end of the presentation. And I'll just take a few moments to answer any questions that you may have about the presentation that we just went through.
Do the DOM have access both HTML and CSS?
Yes, they have access to both. It gives JavaScript access to the HTML structure and also lets you work with CSS in the sense that you can change styles, classes, and visual presentation through JavaScript. there any other questions I can answer? Feel free to take some time. It's okay if there aren't any questions at the moment. I just wanted to I just wanted to take some moment and answer some questions that you may have.
Like, do I have to know overhead through the elements and the attributes of the DOM? Like when I want to change the HTML and the CSS, do I have to like memorize all the elements?
It depends upon what you want to do with when it comes to it depends on what you want to do. So you do not need to memorize every single DOM element or every attribute. What matters more at the beginning is understanding the core patterns, is like how to select an element, how to read or change its content, uh, and then how to change attributes and classes. So if you want to change and if you want to change styling, you do not need to memorize all the CSS to the DOM. Usually you would either add or remove a class, and so that is why I wouldn't recommend memorizing everything. Just focus on understanding how the DOM is structured and how to look up to the right property or method whenever you would need it.
Thank you.
Okay, if there are no questions, let's just move into some of the coding examples and
Sorry
just,
for the late question. How do you access the form element? By the form or by the internal tags?
sorry, could you repeat the question?
How do you just access the form element just by the form or the internal tags inside the
You could do it either way. It depends upon how specific you want to be. So if there is only one form on the page, you could just use the query selector method to just find the form. But if you want a particular form, it is better to be able to target it more specifically. So ideally, you would want to add IDs like sign up form or login form. And for the inputs inside the form, you could also target them individually by ID, name, or other selectors depending upon what you need.
Thank you.
Okay. Are there any other questions? Okay, so if you do end up having any questions later on, let's just feel free to put it in a chat, or you could just raise your hand or unmute yourselves and just ask the question. But let's transition into the coding examples that I have set up for the session. Let me just take a few moments to uh, let me just take a few moments to share my screen again. Element nodes, the most common are most important or most common nodes that we should learn about. So at the moment, yes, there are some element nodes that you could focus on the at this stage. So when people see nodes, that could include different things like element nodes, text nodes, and comment nodes. but the most useful and common ones are element nodes such as headings, paragraphs, tabs, buttons, forms, and inputs. So, because most of the time, those are the nodes that you would usually, excuse me, as I was saying, element nodes such as headings, paragraphs, tabs, buttons, forms, and inputs are usually the ones that you would usually select, update, style, add some style, maybe add or remove or attach event listeners to. So to answer your question, those are some of the nodes that I would remember, but eventually with practice those will just come naturally, and I don't think there will be something that you would particularly need to explicitly memorize. I hope that answers your question.
It does. Thank you.
All right, so let's try to move on to the coding example. I hope that you guys can see my screen. Okay, so this is your typical HTML document where I have tried to segregate everything into different sections, which try to let's just take a quick look from the top to bottom so you can see all 5 sectors first. So the main idea is that everything that you will see here was either written in HTML and then started with some CSS or created and modified by JavaScript. And uh, I hope that by the end of this walkthrough, you will get a. I hope that you get a better idea at exactly how each section works. So let's take a look at our section one. So so you can see we can see a couple of things immediately. The the title for now the title says for original title, but if we take a closer look uh, at our CSS, we will be definitely selecting those using the query selector, because we always want to find the first match and return a single element, and we could change the text content inside it. So those changes will usually happen on page load. Let me just show that first. So this is what the page looks like before the JavaScript, and then can you zoom your screen? Yes, I can. I hope this helps. Okay, so this is the page that after linking the JavaScript, and once I make the appropriate changes and reload this, you will see a couple of things immediately, like like the title, the title no longer says original title; it just says updated by JavaScript, and the list items are styled in alternate numbers, and the first item in the list is called. So so let's take a look at the changes that were done in JavaScript. So first we selected the section title, which was denoted uh, section title, which is denoted by the header 3 and the ID as well. And then we changed the text content using the query selector, and then once we so that gives us like the first matching element, and then after that we change the section we change the color also with the section title dot style dot color, So it shows that once you have access to an element, you can update both its content and its styling to JavaScript. Let's take a look and see if uh, we can try to show the sources as a tree. Okay, so I will take a look at how we could visualize those. But for now, the a nice point to a point to emphasize here is that query selector is for one element, and that once that element is stored in a variable, we can keep be using it to make multiple changes, and then the query selector all uh, helps us. Helps us find the list of items that has been found here, and then it also helps us remove the first item in this that is in this line. And as you can see in the console as well. So a way to take a look at this console i- is just right clicking on the browser and just on the page and just going to the inspect. And once we can also take a look uh, at the list of items that has been found here. And then this is a great kind of an example of how this paragraph was. So now let's take a look at the create element part, where we have created an element right here, gave it some style and some margin. Once the element has been created, we could just append it as the last child of the target. And then if we would also and then so that is exactly in this code is how the first item has been effectively removed. So let's take a look now at our second section. It is more about this is the standard structure for setting. This is like one of the structures for events and events listener. So we just have two buttons here. There's one for a click event and there's one for a hover. And then below those buttons, there is an empty div with the ID event output. So that ID, that div is important because JavaScript is going to update it based on what the user does. So this is the setup for this particular section. The HTML just gives us the buttons and the output box. JavaScript would listen for actions, and then the DOM gets updated in response. So unlike section 1, where changes happen immediately on reloading the page, section 2 waits for the user to do something first. And this is the this is the way that you would set up the uh, so this is the key difference with the events. So the code is waiting for the interaction first, and then in the second section, the JavaScript selects the three elements that we would need, the buttons and the output box. And then we also have set up the click events, and and most important thing to note, if you are selecting a button and adding the on click property just like that without the add event listener, So there would be only one handler allowed per event. So adding a second one would override the first one. So if we click if we click the for so if we click on the button here, you can see that the second handler would has overwritten the first, and you can also take a look at the particular target element itself. And this is how you can set up click listeners and uh, like on click events, and the output that we saw in the console was because of the event listeners, where we saw the event dot type, which shows the type of event, and in this case, it was a click. Then the next nine targets the shows the element target, which shows the exact element that triggered that event, which is the button itself. And this turns out to be very useful because it lets us inspect which element triggered the event, and it also allows us to directly modify that event. So after logging it, so, the we can also add some style to it, and then we could just let the user know that the button has been clicked. And in the event output div, we just add the particular text content, and we set some color of the text as well. So this is the way that you could set up event listeners on. This is one example of how you can set up events and events listener. And similarly, you can see that once the cursor moves to the hover over me button, the text changes to hover over me, and the output div is cleared right after the cursor moves outside of the event. Now, so let's try. Now, section 3 is an example of adding multiple like listeners to multiple events. And let's just take a look at what happens once I click the cursor for each button. So if I click on the red, the output tab changes to red. And similarly, if I try to select it for blue, you can change the background color to blue, and the similar actions will happen for green and purple. So the HTML for this particular section is really simple. We are just using a for each loop, which would just look like this, where we are selecting the color preview div, which shows the colors that we have just seen after selecting any particular color. And then the color buttons are selected with the query selector all. The important thing to note is that all buttons have been given the same class, so that helps us return all the buttons with the class color button. And then we would just write this for loop for each loop. It allows us to write one single event lister, and we could attach it to all buttons together. And so this works because every color shares the same class. So the query selector all returns them as a node list, and then after the loops inside so after as the for each runs to each button and attaches one click listener to each one. So this approach is much cleaner than writing four separate event listers by hand. And let's see. So, and then it also converts the node list from the array. This is useful if you want to use array methods like map, filter, or reduce. So this also is important to note here that the queries that the list that we get from a query selector method is a node list and not a true array. So this is one example of how you can add multiple listeners to attach listeners to multiple events without writing multiple listeners. And now let's take a look at the form element, which is where a lot of the form concepts from the slides come together. First, try to take a look at the notice the structure. The form is divided into groups using field set, which can be seen right about here. You can see that they have been divided into groups, and each group has a legend like personal details and references. So that in turn makes the form easier to read and it is more accessible. So inside we have different input types. There's a text input for full name, an email input for email address, and a date input for date of birth. So this is an example of how you can choose the right type based on the kind of data we want to use it. And then in the preferences section, you can see that there have been radio buttons for experience level. These are grouped together because they share the same need, which is why the user can choose only one option at a time. And then the checkboxes are different because they allow different selections. So this allows the user to select multiple interests if they have any. If they want to choose nothing, they can even choose nothing too. And then in this drop down, you can and then there's also a drop down for country, which is useful for when there are many options and you want to save some space on the page. And then if the and then one point to note here is that all these options have been noted by labels, and then if the HTML is written properly with labels and matching for an ID interview attributes, clicking the label focuses on the selected input, so that is one way that you could improve the usability of Node. So section 4, so this particular section was just understanding the structure of the form before we take a look at the JavaScript that reads and handles the submitted values. So now let's take a look at the JavaScript that handles the form submission. So the first important line is selecting the form itself. Then so in line 120 here, you can see that the form is being selected itself. And then once the form has been selected, we attach a submit listener to that form. So since that is the correct, since that would be the appropriate event to listen for, or when we want to react to the form being submitted. Inside that listener, the first thing we add is this line, which is the event.prevent default. What does is that this is actually one of the more important lines because without it, the browser would default would refresh the page by default, which is to submit the form, which would do the default form behavior, which is to submit the form and refresh the page. So this would wipe out the current JavaScript and JavaScript state, which would in turn cause a lot of issues when it comes to user experience. And then we just try to select the values using the query selector, and then and then for every checkbox and radio value, you can see that the yeah, so for regular text style inputs like a name and input email, we could use dot value to get their values. And so that just simply reads whatever the user has typed into those fields. And then for radio buttons, because only one option should be selected, that is why we use the query selector option. So the dot check part is the key here. It helps us find that one button in that group that has been checked, and then the value gives us the value. And then for checkboxes, we could just use the query selector all with the checked attribute. So that returns all the checkboxes as a node list. And since we want the usual actual values, the next line helps us convert the selected values from the checkboxes into an array. And then once we use the map method, it pulls out each value. So these are some of the form patterns that I think you should get familiar with. And then let's take a look at them. So I'll just enter my name, address, and let's select a date of birth as Wednesday. And now let's just take a look at how the form reacts when we have selected every single thing. And now typically, so now right here you can see on the console, we have actually shown all the form values that has been added. And for now, ideally what would happen is that these forms would get sent to a particular service, but that's another conversation for another time. And then if you want to even clear out this form, you could also do that. It's a button with the type preset. As long as it's attached to the right form, it helps us clear out all the previous inputs itself. And now let's take another look at at the last section, which helps us use the form inputs to add different DOM elements. Here, what you would typically do is that you would type in your name, type your name, type in the role, and then just select any one of these colors. And once I click on generate card, you can see that the card appears with all the details. But if I had to if I had to generate card without providing any values, an error message would pop up which says that those values are required and you're expected to fill that. So let's see what happens when you would try to add another card to card that's already been generated. So here I am. I've added one card just to see what happens. Let's see. I want to add another card with the color red, and now you can see that the previous card got replaced by this one, and we will take a closer look at why that happens once we take a look at the GSS by the JavaScript. So now the reason that the card got replaced was this particular element right here. This inner HTML will always clear what will help us this helps us replay this clears out whatever was inside the output container from before a new card is created. So when you generate another card, the old one is removed first, and then a new one is appended. So that is why the cards do not stack. And then once we take a look at and we also always take look at this particular clause here. So this just checks if the name and the roles have been entered or not. And this is how you can use you can use DOM manipulation to add, update, or review other elements. And now I hope that this example made things a bit more clearer. And now I'll just take some time to answer any questions you may have had about the particular coding example or the presentation that we just went through.